Welcome to the UK video on productivity bargaining in the UK with Dr. Laura William and Dr. Ulke Veersma from the University of Greenwich. In this video we will examine the following issues. We will begin by looking at an overview of productivity bargaining in the UK, followed by an examination of trend UK productivity bargaining. We will examine the public policy scene along with the legal environment. Finally, we will look at collective bargaining in the UK historically to the present day. So what is an overview of productivity bargaining in the UK? Well, there's been a collapse of productivity bargaining in the UK since the 1970s. And this collapse in productivity bargaining can be attributed to three main reasons. First of all, there's been a laissez-faire and voluntarist code of UK collective bargaining and industrial relations more generally in the UK. There has been a profound shift in the nature of UK industrial and economic policies from 1979 onwards, which is associated with Thatcherite neoliberalism and rapid deindustrialisation. Finally, the marginalisation and decline of the trade movement in the UK and globally has impacted on this decline in productivity bargaining. There has been a drive to increase labour flexibility mainly through precarious work such as zero-hour contracts, under the assumption that a precarious workforce is a productive one. So what are the trends in UK productivity? Well, UK productivity is 19 percentage points lower than the other G7 countries. Historically, UK productivity grew at approximately 2% each year. However, since the recession, as you can see on this graph, growth has stalled. Such a stagnation in productivity is unheard of in the post-war period, and poor productivity has blighted the UK for decades. This graph shows us the differences in the manufacturing and services sectors. From this graph we can see that since the recession in 2008, productivity in the manufacturing sector has seen stronger growth than the services sector. Public policy on productivity. There has been a dominance of a public sector logic of restraint on wages. The existing 1% pay cap for the public sector is currently being debated in Parliament, for example. In the private sector, there is an absence of any coordinated industrial or labour market policy. In this context, the Conservative government proposed a strong industrial policy in 2015. This policy linked increased productivity to the UK's overall prosperity and a rise in living standards. This increased productivity was to be achieved via a two-pronged approach. Firstly, improvement in long-term investment, and secondly, the creation of a dynamic economy. This policy, however, received strong criticism. Firstly, it was criticised that the skills, investment and infrastructure needed to ensure that these productivity targets were met are not currently in place in the UK. The Labour opposition stated that a more radical productivity plan was needed to improve productivity in the UK, and criticism was levied at the plan that it was following a managerialist agenda of austerity and financialisation. The productivity policies in the UK generally show a dominance of a laissez-faire approach to industrial relations. In this context, it is important to consider the legal environment. In the UK, there are two pieces of regulations that are pertinent for this research project. The first piece of legislation is ICE regulations, which stands for Information and Consultation of Employees. ICE regulations were implemented after a EU directive. ICE regulations are a framework of statutory rights for employees to be informed and consulted by their employer on key issues that affect the workplace. They were introduced in April 2005 in the UK for companies with 150 or more employees. In 2008, the legislation was altered to cover organisations with 50 or more employees. In the UK, however, this directive and ICE regulations have been implemented slower and more flexibly than our European counterparts. The second pertinent piece of legislation is the Trade Union Act 2016. The Trade Union Act received royal assent in May 2016 and has been hotly contested by trade unions across the country. It's been reported that the Trade Union Act will restrict the potential of trade unions to take industrial action. For example, in order for a strike to be legal, there must be a vote, and in that strike ballot, 50% of members who are entitled to vote must vote. Other more stringent rules are in place for important public service industries to enable industrial action to take place.
Well, let's go back to the afterwar period, where there was also multi-employer bargaining. This is more common across countries that are known as coordinated market economies. This was the picture as well for the UK, and in the 70s there was a trend where there was a need felt for productivity agreements. Productivity agreements that were not focused sectoral level, but at the company level. So productivity at the company and the shop floor level were targeted with productivity agreements. And they would have a focus on productivity growth as the wage levels were sometimes above the productivity levels. And so there was also an attempt to cut pay for overtime and other fringe, pay fringes. With the productivity agreements also had an impact, especially with the change of technology, implicitly also having an impact on the role of the trade unions and an increase of the intensity of work. Overall, this meant this whole trend of productivity agreements, but also the change in the role of the actors involved, the employees and trade unions. It meant also a decentralization of collective bargaining, where company-level agreements were more dominant and relevant than sectoral agreements. Gradually, there has been a change where the coverage of collective agreements is lower, especially since many companies don't have a high level of membership rate of unions. Currently, we don't find productivity agreements as such, and there are various reasons for that. Importantly, ones have a background in socio-economic context. After the financial crisis of 2008, the payment has been slowing down, and the pay increases have been slowing down. And at the moment, talking about July 2017, the payment levels are generally below the inflation level, at a maximum of 2%, which is very different from the period after the Second World War.
So, in conclusion, we can see that the UK is suffering from low productivity. In this context, there is a dominance of laissez-faire approach and a lack of coordinated policy from the state on industrial relations. What dominates the UK scene is a dynamic of financialisation and a managerialist agenda. Thank you for your attention.